the screen share here. Make sure it's working. Oh, hold on 1 second. That's a mistake. Oh, it's not such a mistake. Screen share. You see the Rambam on your screen, Dennis?
Yes, yes.
Okay, good. Let's try to make sure that it's actually working correctly. It's going to go blank for a second, but it should come back on. Hold on. Is it on now? Has it disappeared?
No, it's still on.
Let me know if you lose it. Is it there?
Somebody else.
Oh, well, it says it's paused. 1 second.
Sure. Shame, Rabbi, if it's just me, I think you should cancel it, man.
Not at all. We'll learn it together.
Oy, oy, oy.
You're worrying too much. There's still 2 minutes.
Clock says 12:59.
12:59. Well, it's 12:58 and a half on mine. So
yeah, okay. Should be people.
yeah, well, we'll see. We'll maybe go 1 or 2 minutes after one, and then we'll start. No, we'll learn together because either way, we want to make sure there's a recording. For those who can't make it, we always make the recording available. So there you go, Jeff. Jeff saves the day.
Muted.
Hi, Jeff.
Rabbi.
Hello. Welcome. You just allowed Dennis to calm down. He was concerned. There was no one else coming.
I'm sure people will arrive shortly.
I'm sure some others will also come. You know what? I'll give it an extra. On my watch, it's not even 1 o'clock yet. But I think let's give it 2 minutes just to see if others do come. It's a relatively short chapter today also. So even if we spend a minute or two,
is it
start
easier
a minute or two later.
technical?
What's that?
Is it easier than the others have been, or just as technical?
Oh, you know what? It's if you followed the last 2 chapters, this one shouldn't be too difficult. But you have to get the last 2 chapters were a little bit somewhat confusing, but we learned 1 or 2 principles that we're going to apply now that should make it relatively easy to get through. Because he mentions 1 or 2 kind of scenarios and then spells them out quite explicitly. So, as long as we can keep the picture in our head. Actually, I find this stuff a little bit difficult with space and distance, but everyone has like different ways of thinking. So it is for me, particularly, it's hard to kind of hold my thoughts straight when it comes to this. But if I manage, you can manage.
Okay, great.
And hopefully I'll manage to explain it over as well. Okay, I think let's get started. Oh,
here's somebody.
Hi, Tizia, welcome. Hi, good afternoon. Okay, we're gonna get started. Guys, can you see the text on your screen? You can all see the text on your screen. Okay, great. It's chapter 8, and it's the final chapter of this section. So if some of the people that are not yet, it's because they've had enough of Eiruv, well, then lucky for them. That's today is the last of these laws, and for the rest of us, it's wonderful to be able to. We started actually together the laws of Eiruv last Wednesday because it's eight chapters, right? So eight chapters. So we actually we started this and completed it together. So we begin with the first halakha. I'm just gonna change this. Can I drop? Ein manichim shnei eruvin echad b'mizrach ve'echad b'mayrev k'dei shehalach v'miktzas hayoyim el echad mishnei eruvin or b'shar hayoyim al ha'erev hasheni. Right? We're talking about the laws of what's called Eiruv Techumim. Eiruv again comes from the word which means to mix together or combine. We have on Shabbos a restriction about how far one is allowed to walk beyond the city limits. Biblically, it's 12 mil. Rabbinically, it's 2,000 amot, which is roughly a kilometer beyond the city limits. The idea of this Eiruv Techumim is that you place a meal towards the end of that boundary, so you thus establish a place for yourself on Shabbat. Then you would be allowed to walk until that spot, and then another 2,000 amot beyond that spot. Now, the way the Rambam understands it is that once you set your Eiruv in the one direction, it actually limits you completely from walking in the opposite direction. Now, that's not the accepted view of all the halachic decisive, but it is the Rambam's perspective. So remembering that, he says as follows: a person cannot place, let's say, an Eiruv a kilometer to the east of the city and a kilometer to the west of the city, with the intention that in the morning he's going to walk out to the east, and then he can go beyond that Eiruv. And in the afternoon, he's going to walk out to the west, and he's going to go beyond that Eiruv. According to Rambam, you cannot do that. Why? One is not allowed to place two distinct Eiruvim, one on the east and one on the west, for the same day. And we'll see soon that there are exceptions to this when there's more than one day, like from a Yom Tov to a Shabbos, or a Shabbos to a Yom Tov, or 2 days of Yom Tov. But what happens if he didn't do it intentionally? What happens if he made a mistake? He thought you are allowed to put two Eiruvs, and he put one on the east and one on the west. Or he asked two individuals to set up an Eiruv for him. One went to the south, one went to the north. So then he says, one is now limited. Mahalech karagle shneim. He is only allowed to walk on Shabbos in that area that is common to all of them. So let's get this clear, right? If my home is here, and I set up an Eiruv that way, a kilometer away, right, with the intention to walk there, and then walk beyond that another kilometer, or 2,000 amot, right? According to the Rambam, once I establish a Eiruv on that side, I'm not allowed to walk that way on Shabbos. So now what happened if I established an Eiruv all the way on that side and an Eiruv all the way on that side? So if it was only 500 meters that way and 500 meters that way, right? So I still have 500 meters on each side that I can walk in. Is the area that overlaps. That's fine. But if technically I set the Eiruv up completely to the end of the 2,000 amot on that side, and completely to the 2,000 amot on the end of that side, then I'm actually stuck where I am for Shabbos, according to the Rambam. This is what he's going to explain in Halacha 2. He says, Ketzad, what does this mean that I can only walk in that area that's common to both of them? So he says that he may walk only in the area that is within the Shabbat limits of both of these locations. So for example, if he sent the one person to put an Eiruv 1,000 amot to the east, and he sends the other guy to establish it only 500 amot to the west, right? So now the person that put the Eiruv there can walk, right? Because he's got an Eiruv 1,000 amot to the east, so he can walk to the west 1,000 amot, right? Because the limit is 2,000 amot. Just as somebody who had done it on their own, right, to the one side. And now the person that put it on the west, he can walk east 1,500 amot, right? Remember, the entire length of the area is 2,000 amot. So once you establish an Eiruv on the one side, you can go the other way, whatever's remains of the 2,000 amot. So in this instance, if the one guy put it 1,000 amot to the east, he would be able to go to the west 1,000 amot. The guy that put it 500 amot on the west would be able to go 1,500 amot to the east, right? So now, and basically, so within that area that overlaps, the person can walk. Now, but he says if, and as I mentioned in the introduction, but if somebody established an area of 2,000 amot that way, which is the limit, and according to the Rambam would mean that I'm not allowed to move to the other direction at all on Shabbat. So one is established that side of 2,000 amot, one is established that side of 2,000 amot. I'm stuck in my place where I am for Shabbos because there's no overlap of area where I might be able to tour. A person is, now this is an interesting one. Here he says you're allowed to set up an Eiruv in either direction, okay? And he'll, with the following proviso, he'll make a stipulation. Im erli dvar mitzvah, oinil chatzdi lamachar, v'listrakli l'roch zay, zeh ha'eruv hu shani semech alav, v'eruv shabaruch Hashem eni klum. Basically like this. I'm allowed to, but the Eiruv, remember, was a portion of food as described. That you go in place or you have someone placed for you, 2,000 amot away from where you currently are, or up to 2,000 amot away from where you currently are. So that you would be able to go there and then walk beyond that limit on Shabbos. Now, he says like this, what you would be, now we said clearly in the opening halakha today that you can't establish one on each side intentionally. And if you established one on each side unintentionally, you would be limited to the overlap of space that each would allow for. And if you've gone to the two limits, you would have to stay exactly where you are on Shabbos because you're not allowed to set up two Eiruvim. He says, however, what you are allowed to do is you're allowed to set up an Eiruv on each side with a proviso. Which means to say you put a portion of food to the west, you put a portion of food to the east, but when Shabbos is coming in, you do not yet know, am I going to need to travel east on Shabbos or am I going to need to travel west on Shabbos? Maybe a mitzvah is going to come up to the east, and then what he says is once Shabbos comes in, I can say, okay, I'm relying on the eastern Eiruv, and you'll go that way and you'll go further. Or he hears that some danger is coming his way and he needs to go to the east, then he says, okay, I'm relying on the east one, and the west one falls away. So that you can do. It's interesting. You can put the two Eiruvs there with the intention that you'll decide which one you're using once Shabbos comes in. Right, and then he says, so if it becomes clear which side I need, I'll choose the one. And he says, if I'm required to go in both directions, then I can rely on whichever the Eiruv I desire, and thus go in whichever direction I desire. And if nothing out of the ordinary arises, and I'm not required to go in either direction, then neither of the Eiruv is of any consequence. In other words, it doesn't keep him limited to one space. Remember, if an Eiruv is established, you can only go towards that direction, not the other direction, if you've set it up the full 2,000 amos away. So what he's saying is, if your intention is that actually on Shabbos I don't need any of them, then you can just continue to going about your business, even though you've set up an Eiruv on both sides. If you say, I'm not using those Eiruvs, you can continue to walk around just as anybody else in the city. I hope that's clear. Fourth halakha. So we've been learning about this, the extent of walking beyond the limits on Shabbos. The same would apply to Yom Kippur and to Yom Tov. Okay. Before we learned about the Eiruv Tchumim, which is the Eiruv that enables you to go beyond this, the further than the city limits or the limits of Shabbos travel, we also learned about the Eiruv Chatzerot, right? That's the first Eiruv that we spoke about, which was bringing together different homes within either an alleyway or around the courtyard. Now, of course, the concern over there was a different concern than the concern of Eiruv Tchumim, right? Eiruv Tchumim is about giving you extra leeway to travel further beyond the city limits. The concept of Eiruv Chatzerot was in order to enable you to carry from one area to another area that rabbinically is prohibited, right? Remember, we learned last week, carrying from private domain to public domain is biblically prohibited. Carrying from private domain to a joint communal area is biblically permitted, but rabbinically prohibited because we're concerned that it creates confusion and so on. And therefore, because rabbinically it was prohibited, rabbinically they also gave us a means of allowing it, which was the Eiruv Chatzirot. That Eiruv Chatzirot obviously doesn't apply in Yom Tov because Yom Tov does not have the same restrictions of carrying. However, what this halacha is telling us is that Yom Tov does have similar restriction to traveling beyond the city limits. Okay? Now, he says, this is the next point. So the first point he says is the Eiruv Tchumim applies to Shabbos, Yom Tov, Yom Kippur. And now this point is he's saying is that the Eiruv Chatzerot applies to Shabbos and Yom Kippur. Aval b'Yom Tov mutar lo yotzim rishus l'rishus. But the Eiruv Chatzerot wouldn't necessarily apply to Yom Tov. Why? Because on Yom Tov you can carry anyway. Now, he just says like this. Just as you can make a Eiruv Chatzerot on Shabbat, you can do the same thing for Yom Kippur. And just as you can make an Eiruv Techumim, which is the Eiruv to allow you to walk way beyond the city limits, you could do that on Shabbos. You can do the same thing for Yom Kippur and the same thing for Yom Tov. Fifth halacha. Yom Tov shechol liyot samach l'Shabbos. Now, here's an interesting situation where we have Yom Tov going into Shabbos, or Shabbos going into Yom Tov, whether it comes first or not. Or he says the same law would apply for the 2 days of Yom Tov within the diaspora. So here's something that you can do. He says you're allowed to make 2 separate Eiruvs in 2 different directions for each day of Yom Tov. Previously, we said you can't make 2 Eiruvs for 1 day. But here we're saying you can set aside 2 Eiruvs, one for the first day of Yom Tov and a second one for the second day of Yom Tov, even if the one goes in this direction and the other one goes in the other direction. Or similarly, you can set it up for the day of Yom Tov in one direction and a second one for the day of Shabbos in the other direction. No problem. Okay? We'll see exactly how you do that in a moment. Right. He says, or you can set it up and for 1 day and then one day not use an Eiruv at will. He says, when does this all apply? To the 2 days observed as holidays in the diaspora. Regarding the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah is a different rule. Why? Because they're considered one extended long day. And one may establish an Eiruv in one direction alone for both these days. So interesting, right? And this is an important rule in halacha that we will come up from time to time, which I'll just take a moment to explain it. The reason why he says that you can establish one Eiruv for the first day of Yom Tov and a second Eiruv for the second day of Yom Tov is because these are 2 distinct days. Just as if you have Yom Tov followed by Shabbos or Shabbos followed by Yom Tov, you have 2 distinct days, you can have 2 distinct Eiruvs, one for each of those days. He says that would not apply to Rosh Hashanah, and we'll see soon that some would apply the same idea if it ever happened that Shabbos followed into Yom Kippur, because then it's considered what he calls one long day. So even though it's 48-hour period, Rosh Hashanah is considered what we call one Kedusha. It's got one level of holiness. A practical way that we see this is like on Yom Tov, for example, the first night of Pesach and the second night of Pesach will say Shehechianu. Shehechianu you only say on a new occasion. Why? Because each day is considered distinct. Whereas on Rosh Hashanah, this is an area of I don't know, say maybe confusion in Jewish law because Rosh Hashanah is considered one long day. What we do in practice is if we want to say the Shehechianu on the second night of Rosh Hashanah, and we do want to say Shehechianu, we always include in our meal a new fruit, right? That's the custom, so that you don't have to say Shehechianu just on the day because there's this doubt of whether you should be saying the Shehechianu on the second night of Rosh Hashanah because it's considered one long day. So this idea that you can have 2 separate Eiruvs for 2 days, that works when each day is like an independent day, which is true for 2 days of Yom Tov in the diaspora, or a day of Shabbos and then a day of Yom Tov or vice versa, but it's not true for the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. 2 days of Rosh Hashanah is considered one long day, and therefore you can't have 2 separate Eiruvs, but you can have one Eiruv that will, in one direction, that you can utilize on both days of Rosh Hashanah. Similarly, a person can set up an Eiruv. Now, here the idea is that to set aside an Eiruv that may be utilized if perhaps for multiple Shabbos. But what he can say is that I'm stipulating that this is going to be an Eiruv for this Shabbos, but not for a different Shabbos. He puts it out now, but he says it's only going to be an Eiruv for next week's Shabbos, not today. The Shabbos is for Yom Tov, Yom Tov, the Shabbos. He can set aside that meal and he could say, this is going to be an Eiruv for Shabbos, but not for Yom Tov, or Yom Tov and not for Shabbos. The 7th halacha, Amar Chamisha. What if somebody goes over to, and there's 5 people sitting there, and he says to all of them, he says, you know what, I've got a meal over here. I'm going to go and I'm going to put it over there as an Eiruv for you in case you want to walk beyond the city limits on Shabbos. And whoever wants to use it can use it, whoever doesn't. So so even if this person chooses a companion after nightfall, he can go, because the principle is because the idea is, because this is a rabbinic law, and although the establishment of the Eiruv must take place before Shabbos, and it must be in the place where it needs to be, as we've said, at the time of Bein HaShmashot, but actually deciding to use it or how to use it, you're allowed to do this already once Shabbos comes in. That's the unique lesson that he's saying here. This is what's called Breira. Because it's a rabbinic law, so they allow us to clarify, to determine exactly how I'm using it once Shabbos is in. Even though I can't place it there on Shabbos, it has to be placed there before Shabbos and during that window of Bein HaShmashot, but I can decide on Shabbos if I'm using it or not. Similarly, if a person sets aside a Eiruv and he says, I'm putting it there for every Shabbos, and he says, if I want, I'll rely on it and I'll go. If I don't want it, I won't rely on it and I won't go. He says, and then if I don't go, if I don't use the Eiruv, I'm just going to be governed like everybody else in the city. He may go on whichever Shabbos he desires, even if he does not make the decision to go until after nightfall. In other words, each Shabbos he can decide, leading up to that Shabbos, if he wants to use it. Okay. Sorry, I'm scrolling up and down here. The halacha 8. If somebody set aside a Eiruv for the 2 days of Yom Tov in the diaspora, or Shabbos for Yom Tov, or for Shabbos and Yom Tov, now it's important like this. Although we spoke about earlier that you can have 2 Eiruvs for 2 days, you have to make sure that the Eiruv that is being used for the second day is there. In other words, there's a complete meal at that time of Bein HaShmashot, that window between sunset and nightfall. So how would you do this if you've got one Eiruv going in one direction? Let's say you used it on day one. If you've eaten it, it's no longer there, pretty much. So he says, so how would you do this? What he would do is he must take the meal, place it where it needs to be placed, stay there until it gets dark, and then he can bring it back. And then the next day he would take that same meal to that place, stay there for that period between sunset until it gets dark, and then he can eat it after dark. So he's now established it for the second day. And the point is, you need to have the meals set separately for each day. One, because you have, as we were explaining earlier, there are 2 different sanctities, one for each of the days of Yom Tov. It's not like one long day, and therefore you can't just say that it will extend from the first night into the second night. But basically, the Eiruv that is being set up for day one must be there from the period of sunset until it gets dark of the evening before, and the Eiruv for day 2 must also be in the place where it needs to be from sunset till it gets dark of the second night, meaning before the second day. What in the situation described in the previous halacha? So if the Eiruv had been eaten on the first day, it's effective for the first day, but the person cannot establish an Eiruv without food for the second day. Okay, well, I'll just read on in English. If you establish an Eiruv by walking to the desired location, remember we learned previously, you don't have to actually send food, but if you actually you go stand there, so you say, this is the spot that I'm going to reach to on Shabbos, and then go beyond that. So if he did that on the first day, he may establish for an Eiruv for the second day only by walking to the same location and making the resolution that he's establishing this as his place for that day. Right? We spoke about this concept in the previous halacha, that I'm making this my place of rest for Shabbos. Now, if he establishes an Eiruv with bread for the first day, he has 2 options. If he desires to establish an Eiruv by walking to the desired location on the second day, the Eiruv is acceptable. If he desires to establish an Eiruv by depositing a loaf of bread, he can do that, provided that he uses the same loaf of bread that he used for the first day. But it means that it would have to be there for the second day at that time, at that window of between sunset and nightfall. Now, this is a scenario in the way the calendars that we have set up never actually occurs, but theoretically it could have occurred. And that is Yom Kippur Shechol Yot Erev Shabbos. If you have Yom Kippur on Friday, we never want Yom Kippur and Shabbos back to back, either Friday Shabbos or Shabbos Sunday. Right? We can have Yom Kippur and Shabbat, but not on Friday or Sunday. But theoretically, it's possible. So what happens? So if such a scenario came up, then in Bizman Shemakdish Dishin al Piaria, Yerali Shahen So he says at that time when they used to establish the calendar based on eyewitnesses, and this may have been possible, the Rambam says that according to his view, it should be treated like one long day, similar to what we said earlier about Rosh Hashanah. So you can't have two separate Eiruvs. You can have one that would extend through the entire 48-hour period because it's like one long day. Obviously, because in its restrictions, it's more similar. Right? Yom Kippur is more similar to Shabbos than other Yom Tovs. Halacha 11. Now he says this that we spoke about earlier, that you can set up two Eiruvs, one in each direction, one for each day. It has to be that it's possible for you to get to the second one on Shabbos. If, however, it's impossible on the first day for him to reach the Eiruv for the second day, then the Eiruv for the second day is invalid, which basically means you can't, as we translate, it means you can't establish an Eiruv to the furthest extreme on that side and the furthest extreme on that side, right? Because if I'm sitting here and I set up an Eiruv today for tomorrow, 2,000 amot that way. Now tomorrow, I'm unable to reach the Eiruv to that side because I'm not allowed to move anywhere to the other direction. And because I can't reach my Eiruv in this direction, it's not going to help me for the following day. Right? He says, because the rationale is that the mitzvah of Eiruv can be fulfilled only with a meal that is fit to be eaten while it is still day. Since the person may not reach the Eiruv intended for the second day on the first day, in that example, as he'll spell it out in a moment, then it's not considered to be a meal that's fit to be eaten on that day, and therefore cannot be an Eiruv. So again, so what's implied? What are we talking about? What's the case? He says, if a person deposits an Eiruv 2,000 cubits eastward of his home for the first day, and now because he's established it all the way to the east, he's not allowed to move west at all, right? And if he deposited an Eiruv even 1 cubit or 100 or 1,000 to the west, it's invalid. Because he cannot, according to the Rambam, right, because he's gone to the furthest extent that way, he cannot go this way at all on Shabbos. The rationale is that the second Eiruv is not fit for him on the first day because he can't reach it. And since he's not able to proceed anywhere west, it's an invalid Eiruv. But if he only established the Eiruv to the east, 1,500 cubits that way, and he's relying on that one for day one, and the Eiruv to the other side, he placed 500 amot away, so he can still get there on the first day of Yom Tov to establish it for the second day. That would be considered Eiruv. And the point is that he's able to reach it on the first day, which is when it becomes established for the second day. I hope that's clear. There's a little bit of technicalities. And halacha yadalad yom tov shechol yis be'erev Shabbos eno isa erev yom tov lo yerev v'chases lo yerev tchum ela me'erev hu b'yom chamishi shu erev yom tov. He says like this: if Yom Tov is the day before Shabbos and you want an erev for Shabbos, you can't establish the erev on Yom Tov for Shabbos. You have to do it on erev Yom Tov. This is something that we're familiar with this, which is another type of erev which wasn't dealt with over here, which is the erev for tavshilin, erev which allows us to cook on Yom Tov for Shabbos. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but there's this idea that you need to have an Eiruv that will enable you to cook from Yom Tov to Shabbos. In that instance also, you don't establish the Eiruv on Yom Tov, you establish it before Yom Tov. Similarly here, if it's coming up to a Yom Tov, 2-day Yom Tov followed by Shabbos, and I want an Eiruv for Shabbos, I can't establish it on Yom Tov, at least what we say, not at the first instance, because we'll see soon that you can do it on condition if you didn't manage. But ideally, what you want to do is, let's say Thursday and Friday is Yom Tov and Shabbos is Shabbos. You want to do it on Wednesday, okay? Because you shouldn't be establishing it on Yom Tov for Shabbos. But if it happened, sorry, that's what we just said. Now, what happens if you forgot to do it on Wednesday? Then he says what you can do is you can actually do it on Thursday or Friday, but you do it with a proviso. What's the proviso? So here we come to halacha 15. You'll say on Thursday, now it's already Yom Tov, right? And you're establishing the Eiruv for Shabbos. So you'll say, if today is the actual Yom Tov, then my statements are of no consequence. But if it is not, this should be an Eiruv for tomorrow, right? Basically, theoretically, technically speaking, in the diaspora, if you have Yom Tov on Thursday and Friday, only one of them is actually biblically the Yom Tov, right? Practically both days are Yom Tov. But if you forgot to make the Eiruv that you need for Shabbos on Wednesday, then on Thursday you can say, well, if today is the actual Yom Tov, then what I'm saying now is of no consequence. But if it's not actual Yom Tov, then please, I'm making the Eiruv for the following day, right? And on the following day, he should again, he'll establish the Eiruv, and he'll say, if today is the actual Yom Tov, then the Eiruv I established yesterday should be effective. And if today is the the statement of today has no effect. But if yesterday was Yom Tov and today is not Yom Tov, then let my statement today be effective. So he says, when does this apply? To the 2 days observed in the diaspora, but this would not work for Rosh Hashanah again, because Rosh Hashanah, we say, is one long extended day. It's not like one day and another day. Both days are considered, for all intended purpose, as the actual Yom Tov, and therefore you wouldn't be able to do so. Salek Hilchas Eruvin. With this, we conclude the chapters of Eiruv. God blessed be Hashem, who grants assistance and enable us to finish that. Okay, Shekach all.